Okay.
Okay, welcome back from the break. We're going to get started now. Thank you, everybody. If you could take your seats, please.
All right, are we good? Is this on? Thank you. My name's Kevin Mayette. I'm with Bluesign Technologies, and I'm here to moderate the panel Emissions Measurement and Reporting, which is interesting because when I had agreed to participate, I was telling Kelly, this is my I'm not used to the moderating role, which is, I think it takes a very special skill. So, but we have a really great panel here today. So some experts who I think can really speak to this specific thing. And the other thing that you will notice, I'm standing here at the lectern because it would have felt kind of weird sitting there because our panel is all remote. And we will have them with us, joining us on the screen. Which is great. Instead of sitting alone at the stand there, I figured I'd stand here. But we have three great panelists who will join in and help us with this discussion about emissions measurement and reporting. Without further ado, we're at a point where sustainable business practices are no longer nice to have. But they're an imperative. If we're going to reduce the negative impacts on which result from the warming climate, members of the textile, apparel, footwear, I don't know what the definition of exactly the industry we talk about, fashion, have increasingly acknowledged that their impact and their responsibilities, whether it be established by the Paris Agreement or clear about how we need to make reductions. It's interesting, the recent AII WRI report, which talks about what is the impact of the industry, speaks of a need for a 45% absolute reduction by 2030 on this path towards net zero. And it's a really tall order. Certainly knowing the sources of greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, in your supply chain is an important first step. However, it doesn't stop there. Setting targets for reduction, which drive action, which lead to measurable results, is where we all really need to be. This planet needs this, the industry needs this, and your company needs this, whether this is a voluntary thing or it's going to be legislated and mandated, which is all pointing towards that's absolutely where we're going. In this session, we'll talk to three different stakeholders, all very invested in the industry, imperative to better understand this task. It includes some issues which make this work very complex and challenging. But also, the whole goal here, and I think the theme that we want to talk about, is you need to get started if you're not already on the task, because there's absolutely things you can be doing right now. So our panelists include, from the CDP, Laura Homan. She's the Associate Director of Sustainable Supply Chains. From Textile Exchange, and I hope I get this name right, Elena Thrasavoulou. How did I do? No, okay, but she's the Impact Data Senior Manager for the Textile Exchange. And from the women's wear brand GANNI, Jade Wilting, who is the Environmental Responsibility Manager. So I'm going to let each of them provide you a little context on their background, their organization, and unique point of view on the subject. And we'll follow this up with questions to help tease out deeper insights in where they're working. And then last, we will open it up to the audience for any questions. So with that, who's up first? I believe, Laura, you're up first, correct? Okay,
I
so-
believe that to be correct as well.
okay.
Hello, everybody. So great to be here. My name is Laura Homan. As mentioned, I'm the Associate Director of CDP's Supply Chain Program. For people in the room who don't know what CDP is, we're an international nonprofit organization that runs the global environmental disclosure system with our questionnaires on climate, water, and forests. And in my role at CDP and in managing the supply chain program, I oversee all the companies that we work with in Canada and in the United States that seek to engage their suppliers and want to tackle their scope 3. So our stakeholders range from agencies within the federal government to large purchasing organizations, including large apparel brands, and also, other stakeholders that try to scale action through corporate engagement. For example, the UN Fashion Charters is a part of our program as well, and they're engaging their fashion signatories through this program. So my background is actually in climate science, which was originally kind of the reason why I moved from Germany to the United States a couple of years back to study climate change. I'm currently located in New York City, so not too far from you all. And after studying the science and seeing the problem from a scientist's perspective, I decided to enter this field and tackle an area where we have the biggest opportunity to reduce emissions, but also the biggest risk, which is scope 3 and supply chains. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here today and to talk about emissions reporting and reductions. So look forward to a great panel today.
Great, thanks, Laura. Next up is Eleni, I believe you will be next up.
Yes, that's right. And I did have a couple of slides to run through. So the Textile Exchange intro slides that I think were previously on the screen, if they could be pulled up, that would be great. But whilst that's happening, hi everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. My name's Eleni. I'm the Impact Data Senior Manager at Textile Exchange. I sit in our Climate Plus team, and I joined earlier this year to build out our impact data strategy. At Textile Exchange, we have our Climate Plus strategy, which is grounded by a 45% greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2030. And the scope of that target is for the pre-spin phase of textile fiber material production. Our Climate Plus strategy also acknowledges the impact areas of biodiversity, water, soil health, and not forgetting animal welfare and social well-being across the supply chain. I don't know if the slides are on the screen yet, but I did have a graphic.
Can we get the slides from the Textile Exchange? Sorry, Eleni, we'll be right with you here.
I can always share my screen if that's needed as well. Just let me know. I'm happy to go on and just describe.
Yeah, why don't we? We'll let you keep on talking, and hopefully they'll be able to pull up the screen, and we'll.
There we go. I just saw one flash up on the screen. Well, I've described our Climate Plus strategy. This is just a supporting visual, but if we could go to the next slide, please. I wanted to talk about how our work in the impact data space is really relevant for the panel session today. So we, for our 45% GHG emission reduction target, track the industry's footprint year on year. We're tracking from a 2019 baseline, which, as you can see from this graphic, is around 300 million tons of CO2e for apparel, home textiles, and footwear. This is based on global production data that we collect at Textile Exchange through our preferred fibre material market reports, multiplied with emission factors for various materials and fibre types. Now, our 45% GHG reduction target looks at this against a business as usual scenario, which assumes a 3% growth rate year on year in textile fibre material production, which would get us to an even higher number than the 300 million tonnes presented. This means we need to aim towards 160 to 170 million tonnes of CO2e by 2030. And at Textile Exchange, we've identified 3 levers to reaching that target level. The first is around slowing growth to 1%, so moving from this 3% growth rate to 1%. The second looks at material substitutions within a fibre raw material category. And then the third looks at innovative solutions, whether these are next-gen materials, the power of regenerative or circular solutions, where there might not be impact data to model these out at the moment. So everything that we'll discuss today is super relevant for our work and learning, and I'm looking forward to learning more from our panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleni. And last up,
Jade.
I'm sorry, Jade, thank you.
That's okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I am coming to you live from South Africa, of all places. That's where I'm from. But I'm ordinarily based in Copenhagen, which is where GANNI was founded. GANNI is a brand founded by a husband and wife team, Dieter and Nikolai, who run the organization. We have offices in London, New York, and Copenhagen. We're on a journey to minimize our social and environmental impact. And in 2020, we launched our game plan goal, which has 44 tangible goals to be reached by 2023. And we're actually set to complete those goals this year. Those goals were across 4 main pillars: people, planet, product, and prosperity. I think one of the interesting, one of our more recent and very ambitious goals, which we'll talk about later in the panel today, is our 50% absolute reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2027. And so hopefully we can dive a little bit into how we hope to achieve that.
Great. Thank you, Jade. So I'd like to start with maybe just doing a quick level set on and just a basic question so that everybody in the room is clear about what we're talking about here. And I apologize if there's probably different levels of perspective and understanding. Can I ask one of you to give us a 30-second overview of Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, so we know what we have in our discussion here? And I know I have great climate scientists on the panel here, so who would like to do that? Maybe Laura?
I'm happy to take a stab at it.
Yeah, just a quick overview so we know what we're talking about.
Yes, happy to. So we have 3 scopes of emissions that we're talking about today. Scope 1 emissions are the greenhouse gases that your company emits, so either directly at the company facilities or through your company vehicles. Scope 2 emissions are the greenhouse gases linked to your energy use, so any purchased electricity, steam and heating and cooling. And then Scope 3 emissions, your value chain emissions, are, I like to say, basically everything else, with the bulk of it typically lying in your purchased goods and services. We have 15 different categories of Scope 3, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but I hope this was helpful.
Yeah, super.
Kevin.
Thank you, Laura. And we're going to stick with you for a second here. So why do supply chain emissions matter? And where in the supply chain are some of the more significant emissions found?
Yeah, so supply chain emissions matter, I think, on the one hand, because of their magnitude. On average, we found in our data that Scope 3 emissions, so supply chain emissions, are 11 times higher for the average company than their Scope 1 and 2 emissions combined. So the scale of the problem really sits with Scope 3. And I think the other, part of the equation is that Scope 3 emissions, supply chain emissions, are also, the problem is very ambivalent. On the one hand, I think we have a huge emissions reduction potential in Scope 3. On the other hand, we also have a lot of risk in supply chain emissions because obviously you have much less direct influence on how fast and at which pace really emissions are reduced in your value chain, and it takes a lot of engagement and reliance on a lot of different stakeholders. So there is a lot of risk in supply chains. I think also, due to the global nature of supply chains, which we've, painfully experienced throughout the past couple of years during the pandemic. But then also the scale of the problem. To your other questions, like where in the Scope 3 footprint do we see kind of the bulk of emissions? I think I've just mentioned it before. I'm just going to repeat myself. That usually what we see is really in your category 1 purchase goods and services, especially for retailers, manufacturing industry, apparel companies. That's typically where the bulk of your emissions lie. And I think companies have an opportunity there because they can leverage their purchasing power to, influence category 1 Scope 3 emissions and drive reductions.
Great, thank you. Eleni, let's talk a little bit about Textile Exchange, and you mentioned a bit about the focus. So the first question would have been, where does it primarily focus? And you already covered that. But let's talk a little bit about why you're focusing there, and how that you're improving the data. And it's a huge challenge, I understand, because it's so far upstream. So let me talk a little bit more about, dive a little deeper into that part of the work that Textile Exchange is doing.
Yeah, sure. So just as a reminder, we're focused at Tier 4, or the pre-spin phase of textile fiber material production. And like you described, deep in the supply chain really, and deep when we're thinking about how to model out some of those impacts. So under our impact data function, which is my team, we're looking at how to improve some of that underlying data that gets used and how to make that accessible to the industry along with the assumptions that are being applied, so we know what we're working with. Now, in practice, what does that really mean? We're looking to build out a series of LCA life cycle assessment studies to fill some data gaps that exist. And then alongside that work, given that LCAs can be quite specific to given supply chains, geographies, often specific production systems as well, we're looking at how we build out impact data for impacts beyond those typically included within life cycle assessment studies. So this speaks to our Climate Plus strategy, the plus biodiversity, soil health, water, and them having an equal part in the conversation around our levers to change on material substitution, innovative solutions, and slowing growth as well.
Cool, thank you. Jade. Your organization, and I spent some time on the website. It was really impressive how much information you're putting out there, and being very transparent about your journey, if you will. 29 goals have been articulated on your website. I mean, it's really, if anyone hasn't seen it yet, it's worth the time, spending some time out there. Have you fully measured your carbon footprint, including Scope 3, as we're describing here? And if so, what were your key learnings in doing this in the process of your work? And what have been some of the outcome, in the outcomes of these measurements?
Yeah, sure. I do just want to state that our game plan has 44 goals.
Okay, well, I missed a few.
So,
Okay, yeah,
yeah, you missed a
there's a
few,
lot
but
there, a lot to be read.
yeah, there's 44 of them. So yes, we do measure our scope 3 emissions. In the process of doing the work, what we've really learned is how important it is to align all of the teams that are involved in collecting the data. A lot of the time it's extra work for them, and we need to be really clear on why we're collecting this information and to make it as easy as possible for the teams. And what we found is that it's been increasingly useful to have data handover sessions so that we can understand how the teams have collected the data, and if there's any questions on our side or from our the carbon accountants that we work with. And from, I guess, from the outcome of the measurements, what we've learned there is what we've tried this year is to start measuring on a quarterly basis. Last year, we conducted an annual measurement, and this year we thought, let's try and affect change where possible, and let's break our reporting sessions into quarterly reporting sessions, then with the intention to affect change. But what we've noticed is that because of the structure of our collections and the way that we buy materials, it's often too late to affect the change on a materials basis, which is ironically where we're doing actually the best work at the moment. And yeah, we're doing a really fantastic job in materials. In fact, the collections that are in store now, I think around 80% of it is responsible materials. But that's really something that we've learned over the process of doing our yearly footprint. So I'm curious to see if we're going to start doing it on an annual basis again next year, or keep with this quarterly reporting structure.
Okay, cool. What advice, sticking with you, Jade, what advice to brands who are starting out in this process? What are some of the key to-dos that, I mean, being an organization that has just, it seems to have dove in, to the whole process, what are some of the things that you would tell a brand who's really just starting in this space?
Well, having had time to think about this question a little bit, I remembered how much cleaning up of data we had to do in the beginning. And that's a place that you can really save yourself time beforehand, is to, for instance, make sure that you have a materials library in place that helps to standardize data entries, for example. Simple things that just help to standardize the information that you're going to be using later to report on, firstly. And then secondly, making sure that the data that you're already collecting internally, whether it's with the logistics team or the sourcing team, that the data that they are collecting can serve multiple purposes. So that while they're collecting information on units that need to be shipped somewhere, that there is also space to, for instance, include carbon data. So those are two key two places to start if you were at the beginning of this journey.
Cool. Laura, do you have anything to add? You work with a lot of brands in this space here. I imagine you've got some pretty interesting perspective from a broader view.
Yeah, I would say don't be afraid to get started. Scope 3 is a particularly messy discipline in sustainability, and it's okay that if you don't, get it 90% right the first time, 80% time the first time, maybe if you even just get a rough, broad understanding, that's a great starting point. Everybody is at a different stage in their journey. Some may have started this process a couple of years ago, and your company may just, get started today, and that's okay. I think no one, neither the investors nor your customers nor your consumers, I would say, expect you, to be perfect. I think the expectation is that you're transparent and also acknowledge the limitations, right? We have various ways of calculating scope 3. From my perspective, I would always advocate for collecting primary data. I think LCA analysis are great tools as well. There are different methodologies that you can apply, and I think the reality of scope 3 accounting is that there's no one size fits all solution to this, and there's not one way to get there. And at the end of the day, also considering like all the different categories that you're working through, it's probably a mix and match approach, right? And I guess getting there means you just need to bite the bullet and get started somewhere. And I think, it can be daunting to think about, especially like larger companies or purchasing organizations, thinking about their tens and thousands of suppliers in some cases that make up their value chain. But if you get started, maybe, thinking about your top 60 to 80% of your spend suppliers, or, kind of really start with the big buckets and then work from there. I think that's really helpful to start kind of navigating this journey.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. That's some great insight. Eleni, I was intrigued by the concept of Textile Exchange of LCA plus. Can you please explain to us what exactly does this mean, and why has Textile Exchange had this strategy of addressing the impact a little bit broader than just carbon?
Yeah, of course. So our LCA plus approach goes beyond what you typically measure within a life cycle assessment study, given that we're seeing methodologies being developed for biodiversity, water, through the Science-Based Target Network. There will be an expectation in the future where corporates, brands will be setting science-based targets for nature as they have for greenhouse gas emissions. They're part of the sustainability story and the narrative that sits there. We can't just be focusing on GHG reductions. There may be unintended consequences associated with that across those other impact areas. So our approach really tries to consider all of those impact areas holistically. That sounds like it's quite neat and almost sorted, if you like, from a measurement perspective, but it isn't at all. For greenhouse gases, there are methodologies we can draw on. We do, as I presented, calculate the industry's GHG footprint year on year. There are, of course, a number of assumptions that sit behind that calculation. But then when we look at our LCA plus approach and what we want to be doing for biodiversity, soil health, and water, we'd love to be able to do an equivalent, to have something that shows the overall impact at this global level for the industry, for us to track our progress. But also under this LCA plus approach, acknowledging that that's one part of the impact data story, and biodiversity, soil health, water stress are also context specific. That measurement needs to happen in a slightly different way as well. So through this approach, we talk about having global impacts for landscapes, and then we also have place-based impact assessments or ground truthing for those impact areas that are typically harder to measure at a global level. And what that really means is that we can hopefully track more broadly, but also have case studies, data on hotspots for those other impact areas that really align with what we're seeing at this global level. So they help build the narrative around what we're seeing more broadly. And it's something that we're building out at the moment. We don't have all of the answers. Textile Exchange's role isn't to build the methodologies that sit around those impact areas. Like I mentioned, the Science-Based Target Network are already doing that. They're working on it. We'll look to them for guidance and align with their expectations for corporates.
Thank you. Jade, I'd like to dive into probably a topic you had alluded to, is the incredibly aggressive goal of a 50% absolute reduction by 2027. Do I have that right? Comparing this against many who have already established science-based targets, this is aggressive even by those standards. Can you help me understand some of the areas? What are the levers that you hope to push to be able to achieve? And congratulations on such an aggressive path forward, and I think we need a lot more of that. But what are some of the ways that you hope to get there?
Yeah, thank you. And the amount of times you've said the word aggressive makes me even more worried about achieving this goal. It is a massive goal. It's going to be a mammoth task, and I think on our social media and through various communications, we've alluded to a number of goals that we'll focus on. But what's going to be really important in order to achieve this is implementing absolutely every single lever that we can to try and hit that target. But the 5 that we're going to start with, at least immediately, is investing in fabric innovations, which we already do through our Fabrics of the Future initiatives. We focus on using, for example, certified recycled, proven lower impact materials. Secondly, phasing out of virgin animal leather completely will have a massive impact. Thirdly, focusing on circular business models. We have a target of 5% of our revenue should come from circular business models, and so we'd like to look at implementing potentially more. Fourth lever is setting transportation targets and using sea freight as opposed to the very easy air freight. And our 5th target is focusing on our insetting strategy and committing to that.
Great.
There will no doubt be lots more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, I have a lot more questions here, but I know that you also have questions. So we're going to switch to audience Q&A, which we may have some online, and I'm sure there's folks in the room who have questions for this great panel here. So do we have any online questions, or do we have any room questions here?
Yeah, so for the online questions, the first one here is, how could you set emission reduction targets for a startup organization that is rapidly growing? The baseline assessment of scope 1, 2, and 3 might not be representative of the GHG emissions in the next years.
Who would like to tackle that one?
I'm happy to maybe try to add my 2 cents to that. I think obviously it's difficult for organizations that are rapidly growing, right? And you especially if you're expecting your year-over-year growth to be exponential in future years. But setting a science-based target, such as disclosure, is a journey. And I think the first step is to committing to setting such a science-based target, right? So the Science-Based Target Initiative gives you time to, figure out your scope 1, 2, 3 inventory and to work through this process. So the process usually isn't you contact the Science-Based Target Initiative and you say, we want to set a science-based target by next week, right? Like that's usually like a multi-year long process. And I think that, the starting point is you seem to be ambitious and want to set a science-based target, which is great. And I think I would just kind of take that, commit to this, to this undertaking, and then, start the process and work with the Science-Based Target Initiative over the coming years to assess kind of where your company is going and, work with them through this process would be my recommendation. I understand that this is, probably a dynamic process and not going to be super easy, but I think it doesn't at least keep you from kind of making that commitment and then working through it like the coming 1 or 2 years.
Great, thanks for
I
that.
don't know if anybody else wants to add something to that.
Any other thoughts? Next question. We have a question in the audience right here.
Hi, this is Amy from Eileen Fisher, and this question is for Jade. Hi, Jade. I wondered if you could comment on the infrastructure, the structure inside, how your company is organized to allow you to pursue these goals. Who's involved in making this work happen? There seem to be a lot of different initiatives that touch a lot of different teams, and I think it would be interesting to hear, like, kind of who's running the show, and how did you get the buy-in, and how are you measuring performance inside the company?
Sure. Hi, Amy. Thanks for your question. First of all, I will start with that I've been at the company for 10 months, and it's very interesting to work at a company that is so well known for its sustainability, its responsibility initiatives. And I think the success of their responsibility strategy is indeed how it's organized internally. The co-founder, Nikolai Restrup, is a huge supporter of any responsibility initiatives we have, and in fact, he is the soldier of the 50% absolute reduction target, and suggested that we make it for 2027. So, one of the key, I guess, success factors is having senior management that is on board with your responsibility goals, and is willing to support it at any cost. I think that's just been incredible to see. I'll give you another tangible example. Circular business models is an initiative that is run not by the responsibility team, but by our business and innovation team. I know from experience in other brands, for instance, that's often with brands starting to look at how they might be able to work with circular business models. That's an effort that's often housed within the sustainability team. And I see a key difference with GANNI and the success of our own re-commerce initiatives, rental and re-commerce initiatives, because it's propelled forward by the business and innovation team. I think I'll leave it there for now, Amy. I hope I answered your question.
She's nodding her head. Yes. So other questions online, or we do have more room questions? We have a question from the room here. I'm sorry. Did I miss? The bright light is. We'll get you in a second.
I'm Lynn from Roots, and my question is around confidence in the measurement of the reduction. How can we be sure that the data that's available is actually accurate? I mean, you can change your physical actions, like just by changing your materials, but actually being able to measure it, how confident are we in the available tools and the available data?
Yeah, this is a great question. Behind the scenes, myself and the panel had a lot of conversation and preparation around data and the huge challenge that it does present, and it's an integral and important part of how we move forward. So, who would love to tackle that one?
I'm happy to start. So I think ideally we'd have primary data for every single data point that we need. So what that would mean in practice for a brand would be for each supply chain, collecting information all the way from fiber material production right through to that finished item being sold in a store, and then even consumer use and end of life. That is a huge ask, and there are so many prerequisites to that actually happening in practice. Secondary to that is then, or how can we use existing data in a way that's responsible for these calculations? And then how do we examine that data to understand where the limitations are and be transparent about this? I think Laura's already spoken about transparency. At Textile Exchange, like I mentioned, we're trying to work on improving the data that's available for the industry. There are a number of data gaps that exist across material and fiber types. Now, I'm just thinking of tier 4 of the supply chain, but the same is true across the whole supply chain. Filling those data gaps and improving existing data. At the moment, for our impact calculations, we often use global average emission factors. Now they're averages. So, I mean, that kind of answers your question, if you like. There's this tolerance level to those that we have to consider when we're looking at the results. Ideally, we'd have impact data points related to specific production systems and geographies. And then once you have the traceability in place to know where you're sourcing from, you can pull on those emission factors. But there's a lot of work for us to do around filling those data gaps as an industry and working on that collaboratively.
Absolutely. Do we have time for the question? I apologize, I skipped here.
Hi, yes, question for Jade. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your carbon insetting and how that relates to the supply chain.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. Maybe just in the key difference between offsetting and insetting. Offsetting is outside of your supply chain, insetting inside the supply chain. I am seeing that a lot of insetting initiatives are focusing on nature-based solutions, and how we've approached that at GANNI is by working with 2 suppliers in the north of Portugal who produce our t-shirts and our software collection. Ramil and Rodriguez are their names, and we're working with them to install solar panels as well as improve the local biodiversity on the premises of their factories on the ground. We've successfully implemented the solar panels and the biodiversity project at Ramil, and obviously we're looking at how to scale this. It is possible to scale a project like this. I do understand though that, you know, in order to have more impact, we have to look a bit further down the supply chain, and we are going to look into how we can engage further in that.
Great, thank you. So I'm being told, wrap up. I want to thank our panelists.
One more question.
We have one more question? We have time?
Yeah.
Wrap up
just
or
a
one
final
more question?
One more from virtual audience.
Okay.
Yeah, so this one's for Eleni at Textile Exchange. So which database are you leveraging when bridging the gap in missing information?
Good question. So we're not leveraging a database when trying to bridge the gap or filling data gaps. We're working on building out life cycle assessment studies that can go into databases that the industry are using. So that really means collecting primary data, it going through an LCA process and getting a result that's compatible with the databases that do exist and that our industry is using at the moment.
Great, thanks. So with that, again, I would like to thank our panelists for joining us here today. If I could sum up a theme of a lot of the conversations we've had here is, you see some people who are leaders in this space here. If your organization is at the beginning, the last thing you need to do is to be afraid to get started. There's plenty of resources out there for you, and absolutely do not let perfect get in the way of progress. And so let's make sure that we are all on the task. So with that, thank you so much for joining us today, and that's a wrap. So should we take, do we start right away or jump into my keynote presentation? Is that, pardon? Okay. Well, or I'm fine to continue. It's, yeah, if that's what we can do. I'm all prepared. We just need to cue the session. If we have a little extra time, we can use that in our next break. Just waiting for the presentation. Oh, it is up. I'm sorry. What I see here is not what we see over here. So this is the clicker. I can move from here. Great. Thanks. So, John Archibald Wheeler, who is a physicist, this is one of my favorite sayings. We live on an island surrounded by a sea of ignorance. As our island of knowledge grows, so does the shore of our ignorance. You know, it's interesting. Has anyone seen this? This has been passed around for many years. I'm dating myself by how long I've been working in this sustainability space here. This is an ad for the precursor to Exxon, and look at the headline there. Each day, Humboldt supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier. This was in 1962 that this ad ran. And we've learned a lot since then. And I don't think Exxon is using this ad anymore. My name's Kevin Mayette, as I've mentioned before. Just a little bit about where I hail from. I come from Central Oregon, or I live in Central Oregon. This is a picture, not quite my backyard, but it's a wonderful place, and it's actually the traditional territory of the Wasco, the Warm Springs, and the Northern Paiute people. So I really appreciate being a guest on the land of where I hail from. So there's not a lot about Bluesign. So I work for Bluesign Technologies, and I have been with Bluesign now for 9 years. Prior to that, I actually worked for a retailer brand in North America, in the US, REI. And I was there for 27 years, so I had a long run there as well. And so that's where my perspective from brands comes from. Bluesign Technologies is an interesting organization. You know, many think of us as a certification. The reality is we're a lot more than that. It's more of think of it more of a system. And we achieve our objectives not simply by testing things at the end of the pipe, but really re-engineering things all the way back to the molecule. Working with chemical companies and understanding how they make chemistry and what chemistry they're making, working with textile companies that are making materials. A huge amount of the chemistry that's used in textile, as we all know, doesn't end up in that bulk roll of fabric. It's actually an air emission, water emission, or some other type of waste. And then the specific area that I work at Bluesign is with brands. And so we have many brands that are part of our system. So this is the high level only bit we're going to talk about Bluesign right here today, because we're going to pivot and talk about something else in this process. So who are the companies that we work with? This is just a small subset of the over 700 system partners that are part of the Bluesign system. From the chemical world, these are some names that I'm sure you recognize. From the material manufacturing world, a lot of the manufacturers that are part of Bluesign, you can see here. You know, I mean, we're growing in a lot of the natural fibers. Bluesign really started in the technical textile space, a lot of it in the performance and outdoor space. So you can see that show up there. And this slide here is the one that I love to show because it's really a veritable who's who of the industry. And actually, I wanted to make sure I highlighted 4 great Canadian brands that are part of the Bluesign system. And I really, really appreciate the opportunity to work with these organizations because I learn stuff from them every day. So let's talk a little bit about the textile, apparel, footwear responsibility and climate. If anyone has not read this report, please do me a favor or do yourself a favor, download it and read it. It's not incredibly well written, but it's really about what is, you know, the collective responsibility of the industry. It's the roadmap to net zero, delivering science-based targets in the apparel sector. It's a combined effort of the WRI and the Apparel Impact Institute. Free download. But the interesting thing, and this was before, and I don't want to steal the thunder because I know that Kurt Kipka is going to talk tomorrow, who's from the AII, and he can have our emissions in our industry is going to grow to 1.5 gigatons by 2030. And so this is where, in order to keep this industry, which is total carbon impact on that 1.5 degree pathway. And if there's one diagram out of that report that is just, it just speaks volumes, is where the industry is going and where we need to be going. And the challenge is that we've identified it on the best case scenario. These are the possibility for interventions. We still have a huge gap. Even if we hit them all, how do we actually get to where we need to be? So many have created science-based targets, and that's has been alluded to. And as of 2021, there were 50 brands that have had established their science-based targets. Not all of them are actually, in fact, absolute targets. So most are, but the fact is, I did some quick math. The challenge is on the SBTi website. It's the characterization of who's a luxury apparel brand isn't always right, and there's a retail sector as well. So getting that. The average absolute target is minus 33. So even with those leaders, we have not established what we need, which is the 45% absolute reduction. So these are the leaders of the world. And then we were seeing a lot more progress in establishment of targets. As of 2022, we have 170 plus that have made a commitment and over 110 with approved targets. Clearly, we see that legislative pressure is driving this. So even if you're not doing this for reasons it's the right thing to do and your feeling of commitment, it's going to be mandated whether you're here in North America, we're in Europe, or anywhere in the world. And so we've talked about this in the previous panel about this idea of so much of our calculation of our footprint can be theoretical, based on industry averages and things like that. And so that's it's not a reason to not get started, but we have to realize the lessons of that. It's interesting, I listened to a podcast recently where a McKinsey principal was talking about how the fact at scope 3, we can have a plus or minus 30% swing based upon who's doing the calculating and what methodology and all of that. So think if you had to do your accounting with that level of uncertainty. So the challenge also is that when you're making impact, you can't make impact on theoretical. You have to do it on actual. So we really do need primary data. And the industry is desperate to actually get more. And we heard a lot of that in the previous slide. So interesting, the greenhouse gas protocol was written originally with an idea that we're going to be working off a lot more primary data, and we're not. So that's why secondary data is an integral part of how we move forward. So a little bit about the challenge. I'm going to dive a little deeper. Now, this part, when I was putting this together, I felt like, wow, this is actually really so basic. But the reality is, I get to work with a lot of organizations that are, I believe, really working very hard at this here. And even they struggle at some very, very basic tasks because of what we deal with a complex network. So I want to touch upon what it is, and I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. I have done presentations that have been for LCA audiences or a whole bunch of different audiences on the supply network. And a little bit of the background on this diagram, and I'm just going to go through it really, really fast. You can download a copy if you want, or you can, if it scares you, you can not pay attention to it here. But this diagram came about because early in the space of doing sustainability, I reached out to, when I was at REI, I reached out to about 10 brands, 10 or 15 brands. And I said, what's your tier 1? What's your tier 2, tier 3? And this was circa 2003 or so. And for as many brands as I asked, I got actually it wasn't just brands, it was manufacturers and others. We got different responses. So the diagram really helps put this in perspective, and it's going to help us actually address, and I apologize, it's a bit of an eye chart and small. Brands, retailers that are brands. You have your tier 1, traditional tier 1. Those small circles are representative of subcontracting because it happens at tier 1 in a big way. Tier 2 is so complex, we've even broken it into 2 pieces. We have the formation of grays and the dyeing and finishing parts of that. And by the way, there's a lot of subcontracting going on here as well. Tier 3 is where materials begin to take their shape. Where you have spinning, you have the formation of plastic, pelletization and polymerization, metal forming, and all that. And then tier 4, this was actually the latest update. You know, interesting, people refer to this as sometimes as my diagram. It's not. It's really the industry diagram. I have reached out to many people over and over. This is version 6 of this diagram that has helped us actually become really clear about the space. What's been the big add here at tier 4 is recognizing where the recycled and take back comes back into the network and recognizing that it's a feedstock. And so there's but you have your primary place where it be ag or extractive industry coming from that. There's 2 other parts of this network that are really important. There's those who are actually doing the creation of a product, be an agent or a trading company, and then you have in the material side, you have material conversion. So this puts that together. Where it really matters, however, is also recognizing that chemistry is not tier 5. Chemistry is actually coming in many places into that network, and the chemistry world is equally as layered. And you don't get to the place of creating new chemistry until you're 3 layers deep into chemistry, where actual synthesis is occurring. So you are here, if you're a brand, and that's absolutely an integral part of knowing the complexity of the network. And so this is helpful if we're going to talk about where impacts occur. From an energy perspective, you can see that the patterns will emerge here. And this is actually not from the AII study, but there's many studies that we may not know what the full impact is of the industry, but we clearly do know where in the industry the impact is occurring. From a water perspective, you can see that it shifts a little bit into the tier 4 space, but there's a huge part also in tier 2 as expected. And then from a carbon perspective, it's very, very clear where the focus really should be, and that is in tier 2. So here's an interesting point. We were talking about recycling materials a few minutes ago, and an integral part of anyone's circularity strategy, but recognizing that, you know, material being a feedstock, many of the processes with the biggest impact actually happen after recycling. So recycling is an important thing from a tier 4 perspective, but we can't ignore tier 3 and tier 2 because that's where you can have a lot of impact. And then when you talk about chemistry, it comes into the process in a big way, often after the recycled material actually is created. So brand carbon impact, you know, we've talked about this here. A huge part of what your impact is going to be in the scope 3, as we were talking about this morning. If you break down scope 3, a good 80% of it is in this category we call purchased goods and services, or category 1. And then if you break that down, you can see that half of it is going to fall in your tier 2. So when it comes to actually scope 3 accounting, the challenge is that we absolutely have a goal of trying to be accurate. This is actually apropos with the World Series coming up here. We may have a goal of home plate where we hope we can get into the park. The reality is that oftentimes we're out somewhere in the bay. And this is not a reason to not get started, but it's a recognition of how we need to improve. So I work with a lot of brands, and this is really important to recognize that this is not an easy task, even among leave you with today is some of the more basic ways to get started. And this is not rocket science, is actually make the commitment to really get to know your network. Four obstacles, common obstacles that I see: vendor source materials, supply network intermediaries, I touched upon them, outsourcing at tier 2. I have some data to show what's going on there. And then simply obstacles and commitment in that space. So if we take a look at vendor source materials, this is when, you know what, I'm not going to choose this material because it's not in my best interest. I may be working on a performance material, but the pocketing, the threads, a number of other materials might be chosen by your tier 1 manufacturer. And this is common practice. So this is actually a space where you may not have perspective on your network. And so when I work with brands, I say, don't just tell me exactly who are your brands or suppliers that you know, but who are the unknown, or who are the known unknowns? And do you know them? Are you working on that? Okay, moving forward. Takeaways on this space is 100% nomination is not necessarily best practice, but having the program and having the organization that actually knows this and actually works to know this is really an integral part of doing that. The supply network intermediaries, that is the agents, the materials converters, an integral part of many organizations' supply chains, whether it's someone who's actually doing the whole full package for you, or it's organizations that are actually really focused on material. You know, interesting, from the data we see in brands, around 14 to 15% of a typical supply chain has converters that are actually part of it. And that's not a bad thing. It's just that, you know, unknowns there are quite a challenge. And we know why that some of the information is not necessarily transparent, because the history of I know and this is the special information that I provide by providing you a network. So it's not necessarily a bad strategy to have converters, but having converters and transparency in that space is actually really important. And then this is a really interesting slide and a real challenge for us. And you know, one of the things we may think about outsourcing at tier 1, but what about outsourcing at tier 2? It actually happens in a very big way. As you can see, the number of processes that can happen here, some of the numbers that are associated. This is actually from Bluesign data, where we are able to see what exactly is happening with respect to outsourcing. Upwards of 25% of the dyeing is actually happening at tier 2. So outsourcing is not a bad thing, but not knowing it and not managing it is actually an important thing, and it's really can be a challenge for transparency and traceability. And the last one, and this is really pretty simple, it's really about inertia and commitment in organizations. You know, managing, who does this? Who's responsible for doing this in an organization? And I've assessed a lot of organizations, and yeah, it's pretty challenging to get there. No one that I see is really at the progressive or aspirational level. So, you know, no one-size-fits-all information system, you know, a lack of a unique ID. I highly recommend, if you're not participating with the Open Apparel Registry, please do, because we need this for our industry, and just the challenge of commitment. So in final, pragmatic recommendations, and this seems really, really basic, simple stuff, but it's amazing how challenging that sometimes it can be. Make supply network intelligence and management a top priority in your organization. Assign the role very clearly. Support them with systems. Now, this is really hard because there's no one system that can actually help across the entire breadth of that network. Develop a strategy with intermediaries if they're part of your network. Make sure that you're transparent, but also trust is a two-way street. Make sure that if you are asking for transparency, you're also recognizing that that's part of their relationship. Develop an outsourcing management program. Not to say that it doesn't happen, just how do you manage it and how do you understand it? Learn all your material types. It seems, again, real basic, but the questions aren't necessarily always there. And then lastly, know your material consumption. This is one of the really challenging things. There's very few brands that I can speak to who can actually talk about at a facility level, what are my volumes, and then measured in kilograms. And you should actually make that as a goal. So thank you for your attention.